Hi, good morning everyone, and welcome to Asan Institute. I see many familiar faces today. I want to thank everyone for coming this morning. I would like to ask all of you first to silence your cell phones at this time. And today we'll be providing simultaneous interpretation, so if you have not done so already, but I'm sure all of you already have your device with you. To begin, today we have the official launch of the booklet, Korea Matters for America and America Matters for Korea. Produced jointly by the Asan Institute and the East-West Center, this publication is a reflection and celebration of the ROK-US relations. Specifically, this book highlights several aspects of the alliance, including on the strategic alliance, economic relations, and people-to-people exchanges. We will hear more details later from Dr. Satu Limaye. This publication at this time is very important for the relationship. As many of you know, last year marked the 60th anniversary of the ROK-US alliance. And for this important and timely event, we have invited several distinguished guests to speak throughout the program, as you can see in your handout. We will begin today's program with the welcoming remarks by Dr. Ham Chae-bong. Dr. Ham is the president of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Previously, he was a senior political scientist at RAND. Proper introduction needed, or not so. And also, he previously was a director of Korean Studies Institute at USC, and also worked at UNESCO in Paris. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ham to the stage. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 아산 정책연구원의 함재봉입니다. 양해해 주시면 영어로 말씀을 드리도록 하겠습니다. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to have all of you here for this launch of a very interesting and I must say very original project. I can't take full credit for the project because it was Satu Limaye who actually proposed it to us. I made the wise decision of agreeing to the proposal. It's been a labor of love. It worked out well on so many different levels. It was at the time that we were starting this Asan Young Fellows program, where we were training young future leaders here, and then we were posting them in various partner organizations, think tanks, NGOs in Washington, D.C., and of course, Satu graciously accepted one of our interns there, and he worked on this project with Satu's staff. So it really is a joint operation on many different levels. We've already had a launch of this booklet in Washington, D.C. Was it last year? December last year on the Hill. And we had a huge turnout. We had 6 standing members of the Congress who actually came to give congratulatory remarks, as well as our ambassador An Ho-hyung to Washington, D.C. He also came. So it was a very festive occasion. Once again, I think it really showed the importance of this project, and of course, the importance that all of us attach to this great bilateral relations between Republic of Korea and the United States. I think one of the really great benefits of this is, when we talk about our relationship or the alliance or strategic interests in all of this, we use many very complicated concepts and theories sometimes. But this booklet really shows you in such graphic, literally graphic way the gist, the essence of the relationship, and just how deep it is and how far it goes. Until I looked at this, I wasn't quite aware of just the extent to which the two countries are imbricated in each other on so many different levels. So I think all of you will find this very useful. We already understand that many policymakers find it very useful. And I think we have a website that is attached to this, which makes this even more accessible, which Dr. Limaye will be shortly introducing to all of you. Again, thank you all for coming, Ambassador Sung Kim, General Kim Jae-chang, and General Hwang Jin-ha, National Assemblyman Hwang Jin-ha, National Assemblyman Kim Jong-un, and others. So it's really great to have you all, and I hope you enjoy this morning's session, because it really is, I think, a celebration more than anything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ham. At this time, as Dr. Han mentioned, we have several speakers for the congratulatory remarks, whom I will introduce individually. First, we have General Kim Jae-jang, Chairman of the Council on ROK-US Relations. General Kim served in the Korean Army for 32 years until 1994, and he has major assignments including the ROK-US Combined Forces Command. Please welcome General Kim to the stage. Thank you.
존경하는 우리 함재봉 원장님, 성김 대사님, 이렇게 뜻깊은 자리에서 축사를 하게 된 것을 개인적으로 영광으로 생각합니다. Please put on your the translation device. 아산 연구원과 미국 동서센터가 공동으로 한미 관계의 현 상황과 그리고 발전하고 있는 추세를 분야별로 분석하여 정리하여서 훌륭한 보고서를 작성한 데 대해서 정말 치하의 말씀을 드립니다. 한미동맹이 60년을 이어왔다는 사실 하나만으로도 한국과 미국은 서로가 그만큼 소중한 존재라는 사실을 증명해 주고 있습니다. 지난 60년 동안 한미동맹은 한반도의 안전과 지역 안정을 보장하는 데 사실상 주역을 맡아왔다고 생각합니다. 실제로 한미동맹이 체결되기 이전 60년을 뒤돌아보면 동북아시아 지역은 크고 작은 전쟁이 10년이 멀다 하고 끊임없이 일어났던 곳입니다. 따라서 오늘날 이 지역 나라들이 이만큼 번영을 누릴 수 있었던 것은 안정이 유지되었기 때문이고, 그 안정은 미국과 한미 동맹이 있어서 가능했다고 말할 수 있습니다. 한국과 미국은 장래에 이 지역에서 더 큰 일을 해야 합니다. 그 중에 하나가 한반도의 통일을 이룩하는 일입니다. 어쩌면 그것은 미국이 소련과의 냉전을 승리로 이끌었던 것보다 더 어려울 수도 있다고 생각합니다. 그러나 분명한 것은 통일 한국과 미국이 주역을 맡아서 봉사하는 그때의 아시아는 지금보다 훨씬 더 안정되고 훨씬 더 번영하는 아시아가 될 것입니다. 오늘 진지한 토의를 기대합니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you, General Kim. Our next speaker is Assemblyman Hwang Jin-ha, who is a 3-term member of the National Assembly. Prior to joining the National Assembly in 2004, he served in the Korean Army for 39 years and held several positions there. Please welcome Assemblyman Hwang to the stage.
함재봉 박사님, 그리고 아산정책연구원과 이스트 웨스트 센터가 이제 공동으로 출간한 이 책자발간식에 와서 축사드리게 된 것을 대단히 영광스럽고 기쁘게 생각을 합니다. 제가 영어로 그 축사를 준비했기 때문에 준비된 축사를 영어로 그냥 제가 읽어드리겠습니다. Dr. Ham Jae-bong, Chairperson and President of the Asan Institute of Policy Studies, Dr. Satu Limae, Director of East-West Center, Ambassador Sung Kim, AmCham Korea President Amy Jackson, General Kim Jae-chang, Assemblyman Kim Jong-un, former National Security Advisor to the President Chun Young-woo, and other distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor and pleasure to be here at this book launch event. I deeply appreciate your invitation to this meaningful and unique event. The two leading think tanks in Korea and the United States have worked together on publishing a book titled Korea Matters for America, America Matters for Korea. I express my heartiest congratulations for successful publication. The ROK and US alliance is regarded as unprecedented in that it is the most successful alliance in the history of international relations. This book, published by the two think tanks, will contribute greatly to promoting mutual understanding and the discussion on creating momentum for future developments of the alliance by reviewing our relations in trade, investment, student exchange, travel and tourism, sister partnership between cities, and global partnership for more than half a century. Distinguished participants, we are facing such uncertainty and rapid change in international policies as we have never experienced before. To preserve and promote national interests, the ROK and US strategic partnership is transforming and becoming more vital, diverse, and dynamic through investing all potential resources. The ROK and US alliance is one of the most important and impactful factors for Korea's national interests when looking at the division of the Korean Peninsula and Korea's geopolitical situation critical to superpowers' strategic interests. With the U.S. rebalance to Asia, the strategic value and importance of the ROK and U.S. alliance is highlighted even more. Beyond our military and economic partnership, the alliance is evolving into a comprehensive partnership. Particularly since the ROK and U.S. Free Trade Agreement took effect, the alliance partnership is more and more a part of our people's daily life. In this regard, the publication of Korea Matters for America, America Matters for Korea is expected to promote our people's understanding of the alliance and increase public consensus, which I believe is a critical foothold for sustaining our strategic partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, the Park Geun-hye administration pledged a policy of trust politics for the peace and the prosperity of the Korean Peninsula. Efforts for preparing peaceful unification are at the center of this policy. I am confident that all of us here today are well aware of the strategic importance of the ROK and US alliance for the peaceful unification of the divided Koreas. In this respect, strategic leadership and initiatives through the alliance are much more important now than ever before. And the think tanks and experts in both nations are required to boost their efforts and contribution to government-level cooperation. Again, I want to express my deepest appreciation to the Asan Institute for Policy Studies and the East-West Center for working together in hosting today's meaningful event. I pledge to do my best to assist you in developing and strengthening a bilateral relationship between the two nations. Now, I close my remarks by wishing all the best to all of you here. Congratulations, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hwang. For our next speaker, I would like to invite Ambassador Sung Kim, the current ambassador of the United States to Republic Korea, to the stage. Sorry, I feel the pressure.
That was the shortest introduction I've ever had. I guess I should thank you. 안녕하세요, 쌍킴입니다. 저도 영어로 하겠습니다. President Ham, General Kim, Ambassador Chun, Representatives Kim And Huang, President Jackson, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to join you here at this wonderful Asan Institute for this special event. I have to say, the U.S. Embassy does so many things with the Asan Institute that it feels like home, except your building is newer and nicer. My good friend Ham Jae-bong has done a wonderful job of turning this institute very quickly into one of the leading think tanks, not just in Korea, but across the region. So congratulations, Jae-bong. Asan hosts stimulating conferences, publishes wonderful academic work that are policy relevant, and provides a very valuable platform for speeches, including by many officials from Washington. And of course, we all know about the great work of East-West Center, and it's great to see Satu here. The publication Korea Matters for America, America Matters for Korea is just the latest example of the Asan's and East-West Center's great work, really works that help us focus on the importance of U.S.-Korea relationship. The publication highlights the breadth and depth of our bilateral relationship with hard data in numbers so that everyone can understand. It is a very useful thumbnail for explaining in concrete ways the many facets of our bilateral relationship. As some of you know, I often talk about the 4 pillars of U.S.-Korea relationship. Security alliance, of course, cooperation on global issues, strengthening people-to-people ties, and expanding economic partnership. This publication captures that idea perfectly. It shows the explosion in our trade and investment over the last decade, and the additional jobs in both of our countries that this creates. Behind the numbers, we hear countless stories of successful Korean investments across the United States, from companies like Hyundai Motors manufacturing in Alabama and Georgia to Samsung semiconductor fabrication plant in Austin, Texas. American companies likewise do substantial business in Korea across every market, from orange juice to automobiles. The U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which just celebrated its 2nd anniversary, has already contributed to this mutual prosperity, and we remain very much focused on making sure that we implement the agreement fully so that we maximize the benefits from this historic agreement. Korean tourists and students go to the United States in droves to study and travel, and increasingly American students and travelers come to Korea to do the same. Korean Americans are now counted in the million designator and playing a special role in bridging the 2 countries. And of course, there's our indispensable alliance, which remains so critical to peace, prosperity, and stability on the peninsula and beyond. As this publication makes clear, the strategic interests of the United States and Korea are intricately intertwined at many levels, and this will not change. So again, my congratulations and thanks to Asan and the East-West Center for taking this initiative on this very important project. And congratulations and thanks to everyone who contributed to this excellent project. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Ambassador Kim. Last but not least, for congratulatory remarks, I would like to invite Ms. Amy Jackson, President of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, to the stage. Thank you. Short is good. Thank you.
Yes, I also think short is good. The Honorable Hwang Jin-ha, the Honorable Sung Kim, the Honorable Kim Jong-hoon, General Kim Jae-chang, Dr. Ham, and Dr. LeMay. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to say on behalf of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, it's my honor and pleasure to congratulate the Asan Institute for Policy Studies and the East-West Center on the co-production of this important publication. As someone who represents the American business community in Korea, this booklet has very special meaning to me. As you know, last Saturday, we celebrated the 2nd anniversary of the implementation of the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement. I think everyone in this room knows how much effort was put into paving the way for KORUS. Indeed, it was a long and hard road, and many, including AmCham and many of you here in the room, contributed to this effort. And a special mention must go out to Ambassador Kim, as well as Jae Kim, former trade minister, for leading the efforts to get the FTA passed and implemented in both countries. So please give them a big round of applause. But we realize that none of our efforts will have borne fruit if we don't continue to inform policymakers, stakeholders, and indeed the citizens of both of our countries that FTAs and other agreements like KORUS are indeed bringing benefits home to both countries. And in this regard, the efforts of leading think tanks such as Asan Institute and the East-West Center have played a key role in helping shape policies that bring our two nations together to benefit both economies, and indeed bringing this kind of very specific information down to earth in a way people can understand, that show that benefits are accruing to both countries from the FTA and other policies our governments actively pursue. Building on the firm foundation of the KORUS FTA, I'm confident that the economic partnership between our countries will continue to grow and mature going forward. In many ways, KORUS is about more than just growth of exports, of course. It's really about growth in people-to-people ties and exchanges across the board. For example, since the FTA went into effect, I have been contacted by an increasing number of U.S. companies and potential new U.S. investors who would like to look to enter into the Korean market for the first time. We are also hearing about, similarly, Korean companies expanding into the U.S. market. We're confident that our governments will continue to work closely to ensure that KORUS is implemented successfully. To ensure continued success and full implementation of the KORUS FTA, a delegation from AmCham will be visiting Washington, D.C. next week for our annual door knock. This is where we go and meet with senior officials in the administration and members of Congress to talk about important things in U.S.-Korea relations, including the FTA. And this year, I think the Asan Institute and East-West Center's beautiful publication provides us with great information that we can use on the ground when we meet with these senior officials in Washington next week. So we really thank you for this timely input for us. We wish that the publication of Korea Matters for America, America Matters for Korea will bring continued co-prosperity between Korea and the United States. Once again, congratulations for this great accomplishment, and we look forward to working with you in the future on similar publications. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson. At this time, as we prepare for the next part of our program, I would like to first briefly introduce Dr. Satu Limaye, who will be introducing the booklet to you today. Okay. Dr. Limaye is the director of the East-West Center in Washington, and he is also a senior advisor at the Center for Naval Analyses Corporation. Previously, he was a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses and Director of Research and Publications at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, which reports directly to the U.S. Pacific Command. Dr. Limaye was also an Abe Fellow at the NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies and a Luce Scholar and Head of Programs on South Asia at the Japan Institute of International Relations. And at this time, as we prepare the PPT, I would like to invite Dr. Limaye to the stage, to the podium, for his presentation. Thank you.
Going to use it for a timer. I'm very delighted to work with Asan Institute, with Dr. Ham and his colleagues, and in particular, I want to flag the Asan Academy Fellows, 3 of them, who were with us in our office in Washington, who helped us to do the work on this program. So I'd like to briefly, I see one of them here, Jisoo Lee, did a lot of work in background research, and we're delighted to see you as well, Jisoo. What Dr. Ham and colleagues have asked me to do is simply tell you a little bit about the project, since it's been so kindly introduced. Let me tell you a little bit, and I just want to answer 3 or 4 questions. What is it? Why did we do it? How is it being used, and how might it be used in the future? So let me just talk my way through it. Is the website up? Okay. First of all, let me just say that the Korea Matters for America project is part of a larger project, as you can see, called Asia Matters for America. We started this a few years ago in our Washington office when I became director, because I had come from working in Hawaii, more on the military side of the house, and I felt it was very important as we enter the 21st century to talk about how America's growing relations with Asia and America's growing links in Asia impact both sides, not only, of course, at the national policy level, but at the local level, in ways that people who aren't at the Asan Academy, or Asan Institute, aren't at the East-West Center, can appreciate and understand. In other words, a public resource. So you can see that the project consists of 3 things. A booklet for Asia, Korea. There's also one for Australia, Japan, ASEAN. We're working on China, India, and Taiwan. So we will cover most of Asia in those relationships. So product 1 is the booklet. The centerpiece is an ongoing living website which allows you to look at all of these places geographically and to look at 4 areas, which are trade and investment, politics and security, education and exchange, and everyone's state and district in the US, and either a state or a province in the Asian country or region that we're looking at. So if you see, we constantly post new articles, new information, new statistics, new graphics, new stories. And I will be very clear about this. All of the stories are not about major policy issues. For example, we recently had a post on medical tourism to Korea. The idea is to cover the range of, as Ambassador Sung Kim pointed out, people-to-people ties, economic ties, of course security ties, but also the growing linkages both regionally and globally between our 2 countries. So that's the website, and I would ask you, if you have time, to please go to the site. Would you please press on the South Korea site? You can download articles that are specifically related to Korea, including a copy, of course, in PDF of the publication. And one of the things I'd like to encourage with Dr. Ham and Asan Institute's, of course, approval and support is to send us ideas for articles, because one of the things we're also interested about is the way that the US is interacting in Korea. So stories about companies doing interesting things, about social projects, about educational projects, about people-to-people projects, because we want this to be a resource that we use. So I've told you what the product is and what the initiative is, how to use it, and I will leave it to your own time because I won't take time to use it. Why did we do this? One thing we did it is because I think that the concept of Asia in the US is complicated, and we wanted to focus on our great partnerships with a country like Korea. So we did it because Korea is so important. In fact, as we have an American expression, sort of, bats above its level, or hits, is so much more important than we give it credit for in terms of discussions sometimes only at the national policy level. It reaches into every community, and we try to show that through the data. The second reason we did it is because we wanted to kind of address this narrative that's developing that China is more important than every other country. What we simply wanted to say is, of course China is important, but America is still important to Asia, and other countries in Asia are still extremely important to the United States. And we consistently show this by dealing with this narrative across all of the countries. The third reason we did it is because we wanted to be an ongoing platform. Of course, there are many important initiatives and reports and activities that both the Asan Institute and the East-West Center do. But we didn't want to have a one-off report. We wanted to create a website that was a living resource that's an ongoing product that can be contributed to by both Koreans and Americans about the relationship, so that it becomes a regular source for people. And the fourth is, given the East-West Center's mission, which is to prepare Americans for a time in which Asia is more important to our national life. We wanted to use this in undergraduate education, in sister city partnerships, in local communities, in local politics, and of course in our relations with the private sector, like Amy suggested about the roadshow with interacting with Congress and officials. So we wanted to use this as a tool, as a platform, not as an end state on its own. Now, so I've told you about how we're going to use it. I will just conclude a little bit by saying some of the challenges. So it's fair to tell you some of the things that can't be captured in a project like this. One thing that can't be captured is some of the statistical problems. In other words, as people say, how accurate is this? And I say that coming back from a science or mathematical background, it's not physics. It's numbers, it's data, they're imperfect. But we use consistent data. We both, Dr. Ham's team and I, worked very carefully to compare our numbers. And they're for reasons of methodology, for reasons of approach, they are slightly different. But they give you a basic baseline in which to think about the relationship. And if you use common numbers, they give you a way of thinking about the trend lines and the changes in them. So that's one thing I wanted to say about problem. The second thing that we find in using them is we have found that our colleagues in Korea, as in Japan and ASEAN countries and others, sometimes use graphics and data differently. The perception of them is different. So we were really happy with the teamwork between Asan and East-West Center to design graphics and to design statistics that were understandable to both countries. And you can see that we worked very hard to create a document that would be in both languages. This was tricky to do on a publication like this, but we felt it was very important that we put English and Korean side by side, because it not only has the symbolic importance of doing this together, but it allows us to share perceptions of the data and graphics. And the fourth thing that we sometimes run into, and I'm in the interest of full disclosure and being honest about this, sometimes in this type of project, we can't capture some of the more, if is sometimes put as maybe negative or downsides of relations, okay? We can't carry every political change or some numbers in one industry that are not as good as the positive numbers in another industry. So we constantly struggle how to show these, and we constantly get feedback from our colleagues in the Congress, other think tanks, government agencies about, well, what if you showed this, or how could you better show this? So to me, this is a good thing, because that means it's a product that's constantly being used and vetted and being responded to and can be improved. So I just wanted to give you a basic introduction. I would urge you, when you have time, to spend some time on the site. There is a place to write to on the site where you can send comments if you find mistakes, if you find discrepancies. And most of all, we look forward to your ideas about how to add things to the Korea Matters for America, America Matters for Korea booklet that will show the expansion of this narrative. Because I want to end with one final comment. One of the remarkable things I found out in doing this particular one, because I'm not a Korea specialist, I'm not a Korea scholar, is just how wide and deep the relationship is, to how many congressional districts and states that the relationship is spreading, and most importantly, how a new narrative is being established between these robust democracies. In other words, not just a history of security alliance and shared sacrifice of the Korean War, but a forward-looking 21st century relationship in which trade, investment, education, social exchanges, joint cooperation, global partnership is informing the baseline of a new generation. With that, I thank you very much.
The moderator for the session is Dr. Chae Gang, Vice President of the Asan Institute. Previously, he was the Dean of Planning and Assessment at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy, Professor and Director General for American Studies at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and National Security, and a research fellow at the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses. Other panelists include Mr. Kim Jong-hun, a member of the National Assembly. Previously, he joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1974 and missioned for foreign services in France, Burkina Faso, Canada, Geneva, and San Francisco. He is also the longest serving Minister of Trade, notably, as we heard earlier, concluding during his tenure at FTAs with India, EU, Peru, and the United States. And lastly, we also have Ambassador Chun Young-woo, Senior Advisor at the Asan Institute. He is also Chairman and founder of the Korean Peninsula Future Forum. Previously, Ambassador Chun served as a National Security Advisor to President Lee Myung-bak from 2010 to 2013. And at this time, we have the stage set, and I would like to invite the speakers to the stage at this time. Thank you.
네, 반갑습니다. 네, 반갑습니다. 이번 전문가 좌담회 사회를 맡은 최강입니다. 이번 회의에서는 여러분께서 허락을 하신다면 영어로 진행을 하도록 하겠습니다. Please allow me to speak in English because we have foreign guests here. So, it is my great pleasure and honor to chair this session. So, and also actually each can have about 10 minutes for his remark. And then I'd like to ask you to focus maybe 3 points. Because actually Dr. Lumae and also Dr. Ham Jae-bong and also the other speakers have already covered contribution we have made over the past 60 years. But I'd like to ask you to focus more on future. So what kinds of challenges and opportunities we have ahead of us? Second, what are the strengths and weaknesses you can think of it? And then finally, what kinds of recommendations you can make to overcome the challenges and actually exploit the opportunities ahead of it. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Minister National Assemblyman Kim Jong-un for his remark, please.
Oh, I start?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure for me to meet you all. The topic given to me today is quote-unquote trade. And trade was the subject that I pursued for the last 16 years. The latest 16 years, I mean the latest 16 years of my 37 years of services as a government official. Now that I quitted Korean government and has become a member of a National Assembly, we call usually assemblyman, but sometimes my friends will give me a kind of a cynical joke that you assemblymen are now actually dissembling nation, which I really don't like. I try to assemble the nation. Well, if I put it assemblyman or congressman in a more generic way, then we are all politicians. Well, I think there are very fundamental differences between the two jobs that I've done so far. Trade involves a lot of numbers, figures, and analysis and trend, while politics that I'm now being engaged, if not all the time, very often time, it works on the basis of senses, feelings, and instinct or intuitions. So this is quite different, and I'm now living in a very different world. Therefore, let me tell you this morning how I feel, how I sense the performance of Korea-US Free Trade Agreement for the last 2 years, rather than presenting you numbers and figures and analysis. Well, first, at the final stage of the congressional approval, both in Korea and in the United States, there was a very fierce debate, national debate, here in Seoul and there in Washington, D.C. And in my mind, the debate is good in any democratic society. And through debate, different views can converge. In Korea at that time, some people, again, some politicians, particularly in an opposition party, name called me as quote and unquote traitor. And they say traitor that I sold out the sovereignty of Korean nation, which I thought really so extreme a nonsensical vilification. For anyone to respond, to find a ground to, what can I say, compromise. So that was a purely personal, nonsensical vilification. But what is important, why I introduced you that episode this morning, since I became the congressman, and since KORUS FTA took effect for the last 2 years, no one has ever repeated that vilification against me. Maybe they do understand how Korea-US Free Trade Agreement works for the mutual trade relationship between our two countries. That's the first point I sense when I think about KORUS FTA. Or second, ROK and US is mutually important trade partners. No one can deny that. And such partnership has been much further strengthened since the KORUS FTA entered into force 2 years ago. Despite some difficult circumstances due to global economic downturn in recent years, the two-way trade volume between Korea and United States increased very steadily, and data shows us that Korea benefits a little bit more. And particularly in trading goods, Korea is enjoying kind of growing trade surplus, and which has become an easy clue for some American politicians and some American organizations to assert that free trade is not good for U.S. economy, which is wrong, I think. Well, here I would like to tell you, if you look at another statistics, particularly trade in services, U.S. is enjoying a constant surplus, and the amount of surplus is almost the same as the one Korea is enjoying, in terms of trading goods. So all in all, I think the trade between our two countries, whether all together in goods, in services, in good balance and steadily increasing. Well, and further to that, U.S. investment to Korea is ever increasing and very rapidly since the free trade agreement entered into force. And this is also very good for both Korea and United States because Korean government, as President Park said already, that we try to promote or strengthen the competitiveness of Korean services industry. And to do that, we should open our services market more to outside businessmen and business companies. And through that, we try to boost our own domestic, sorry. Through that, we try to boost up our domestic demand. So increasing U.S. investment is good for Korean economy, at the same time, good for your increasing surpluses in trade and services because investment will bring you some, outcomes. Well, in my mind, the U.S. market is very important, and I try to emphasize to all Korean business persons why U.S. market is important and why Korea-U.S. free trade relations is important for Korean economy. Number one, U.S. market is big, very important. It's a very big market, and U.S. market is open and competitive. You should be ready to compete with the other suppliers, other countries in that local market. And three, U.S. market, there's consumers of all categories. If I say, I may put this way, well, there are consumers looking for cheap Charlie products, and there are consumers who look for real deluxe and high-end products. So this is a whole range of varieties are there as a consumer market. So how Korean products are well perceived or well chosen, or how badly it is rejected by the local consumers there in American market is very important indications how Korean companies are doing outside of Korea. So in that sense, if I look at statistics, the numbers I found yesterday was in 2011, the market share of Korean products in U.S. Market was 2.57%, which is not really high. Sometimes late 1990s, we hit over 3%. And since then, we have never hit 3% and more. It's down a little bit. But anyhow, last year in 2013, the market share of Korean products in U.S. market was 2.75. So this is a quite increasing, and the trend is there. I think maybe this is one of the merit of the free trade agreement that we concluded. Let me tell you what I believe, how trade relationship implies for the overall relationship between the two countries. We Korean people cherish really the relationship with the United States. And the best way in my mind to keep that relations strong and stronger is to shorten the distance between the two markets. Dr. Lemay showed us a map across the Pacific, here and there, Asia and United States, and with some lines there. And I particularly look at the broad, very wide line, stronger line than a very narrow lines. So this kind of free trade between U.S. and Korea is really a broad highway which connect and make the two markets closer. And if it is concerns about the physical or geographical distance, we cannot do that. We cannot shorten the distance. But the more products, the more services move back and forth between the two markets, then that means the two markets get closer. And that is the best way to make the relationship between the people working in that two markets closer. And that will be the best way to have national, diplomatic or all-in-all relationship between the two countries is stronger and steady. Well, in that sense also, Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement is really very instrumental to keep our overall relationship stronger and ever stronger. Well, since I quit the government, I'm not really pursuing about the real performance in details of this free trade agreement, but commonsensically, whatever the agreement, since it is concluded and put into effect, then there's some, differences of views or some complaints or grievances or some, I put it in a generic way, implementational issue. But if you look at the text of Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, there's a very solid and strong review mechanism in many levels, very structuralized. So this is that kind of structural review mechanism should be instrumental to find solutions for whatever kind of implementation issues. Well, moving over to, may I have 2 more minutes?
Okay, sure.
Yeah, thank you. Moving over to global trade. Efforts to further liberalize global trade has been stalled. Everybody knows that. And we have experienced a deep frustration of a failed Doha round. Well, WTO, the secretariat is still there in Geneva, but it functions in areas like dispute settlement or trade policy review mechanism, what you call TPRM. Those 2 areas are very important, but as far as further trade liberalization, we didn't hear any good news. And no one can say it proceeds well. So that's why I told you in the vocabulary that there was a very deep frustration on that. Well, having said that, many countries are moving over to the other way around. I may say minilateral, not multilateral. Minilateral or regional. So, U.S. is trying to carry the torch again across the Pacific, across the Atlantic. Across the Atlantic, U.S. is working with the European Union, and across the Pacific, U.S. is working under the name TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Am I right? Yes. Well, Korea is also working very hard, to have a kind of a regional cooperation. What can I say? Institutions. Well, we've been so far very successful. Bilaterally, we concluded a free trade agreement with India, Australia, and ASEAN countries as a whole. But we try to do the same with Japan and China, bilaterally or trilaterally. Bilaterally with China, it proceeds slow but steadily, inch by inch. But with Japan, my view is very, very, what can I say, frustrating. It doesn't move at all. And if I put it in a trilateral setting, Korea, Japan, China, no progress at all, either. Well, particularly since the Japanese Prime Minister Abe repeated his, I may say, some insolent statements about past history and territorial disputes. So, all in all, it is very hard to find any kind of momentum to push it forward. I personally find really a kind of anti-momentum for the time being, push it backward. No one is now boldly, launch the agenda of a trilateral free trade agreement with Japan, including Japan, in Korean society. Well, having said that, as I told you, U.S. is carrying torch for successful conclusion of a TPP. But as far as I understand, the talks are now being delayed, particularly Japan is there. And while the other hand, Korean government has already declared that we are ready to get on board. So at this occasion of my presentation to you, I would like to, once Korea get on board the TPP, with the cooperation of the United States, who is already a FTA partners, important partners, Korea may contribute to the speedy, procedures or speedy development of TPP negotiations. So, it is very, not happy news that TPP talks are being delayed now. But we don't need to be frustrated. Once U.S. open your mind and let Korea get on board, then Korea will help all the groups speedily move onward. Well, so I think it is pertinent time to all existing members of there to think about Korea's membership in the final stage of talk of Trans-Pacific Partnership. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Minister Kim, especially for highlighting the Korea's keen interest in joining the TPP and what kinds of countries can make it. And also he made it very clear that the strategic importance of enhancing or strengthening the trade section between the two countries. It will bring people and society together, and also it can provide a concrete idea what kinds of benefit and feasible interest we can get out of our bilateral relations very much. But actually, I like to ask a question, but for you, actually, what could be the relation between TPP and RCEP bilateral? So there is a conflict between the TPP and an RCEP. So that's one. The other one is like, for example, when I attended the same book launch meeting in Washington last December, actually the U.S. participant actually made a point that South Korea should do the follow-up on FTA. So what is the current state on that, kind of domestically, what South Korean government should do for further enhancement of FTA with the United States? So what can we do with that? So, and then now I'd like to invite our senior advisor, Ambassador Chon Young-ho, for his comments.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't expect such a big crowd, and I didn't expect such a distinguished audience. But it's great to be here. Let me begin from what National Assemblyman Kim mentioned about selling out national sovereignty. I would like to remind you that all international agreements, bilateral or multilateral, all agreements, all treaties are about selling out national sovereignty. So it's not unfair to hear accusations about selling out national sovereignty. All agreements are, about selling out. But what matters is what we get in return. In the case of the defense treaty with the U.S., U.S. had to give up its national sovereignty, not to defend the ROK, in exchange for some of our own concessions on our sovereignty. There are a lot of complaints about the basing, arrangements or some criminal offenses committed by U.S. servicemen. These are the kind of price we pay in exchange for U.S. concession on their own sovereignty. They don't have, without defense treaty, U.S. has no legal obligation to defend Korea. So what matters is whether there is a balance of interests that both countries pursue. And I think every one of you will agree that the alliance has been, ROK-US alliance has been the most successful such alliance in the world. From the fact that it has been successful in deterring an outbreak of war on the Korean Peninsula, which is very important. And in addition to that, it has underwritten, it has provided stability, security, which proved central to economic development and prosperity we enjoy. Think about how Korea will be where we are without the security commitment backed by military presence, robust military presence of the U.S. And many people now, after 60 years of alliance, many people take the alliance for granted, but I think without alliance, I'm sure that we would not be where we are. But the alliance is more than just a military alliance now. It has evolved into a more comprehensive, multidimensional one that encompasses not only security cooperation, but as Ambassador Kim mentioned, now economic dimension is an important element of the alliance. And we also have very close relationship in social, cultural areas. We have tens of thousands of Korean students studying in the U.S. And I think given the geographical distance between our two countries, we have such intense relationship across all areas of human life. And we are also a strategic partner, not only for the defense of Korea or security of Northeast Asia, but we are working together in combating terrorism and preventing proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, not only in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, but in the Middle East, elsewhere in the world. But looking forward, I think we have, ROK and US have more to contribute to not only to the stability, peace and stability of this region, Northeast Asia, but in dealing with challenges, global challenges elsewhere. But I think the most immediate challenge that we have to meet is how to neutralize North Korean nuclear threat, missile threat, before we are pending the denuclearization of North Korea. I think that's the most important thing we have to work out. But looking forward, I can think about at least three key variables which will play vital roles in shaping the future of the ROK-US alliance. One is how we work together to denuclearize North Korea. And there is a feeling in Korea, and very strong feeling within this institute, that there is still far more that the US can do in mobilizing its political commitment so that we can change North Korea's strategic calculus. I don't think the international community has done enough to create the right incentives for North Korea to denuclearize. Under the current sanctions regime, even if I were national security advisor to Kim Jong-un, I wouldn't advise him to give up nuclear weapons because the sanctions are so weak, they have no real teeth. So it's better to suffer a little bit economically than giving up nuclear weapons. Unless we can muster with the US leadership the political commitment to tighten the sanctions which should be biting enough to change North Korea's strategic calculus, I see no hope of peaceful denuclearization. And what do we do without peaceful denuclearization? So I think we haven't done enough. I think there is more US can do. If US can muster the same level of political commitment that they mobilized to deal with the Iranian nuclear program, which is, I think, at least 5 times, 10 times more robust than the sanctions on North Korea, which is focused only on the military activities, military sales of North Korea. I think there is still a hope. And how we can get Washington to mobilize its political resources, the capital, to go for, to try to introduce working or biting sanctions. I don't think six-party talks will work under the current circumstances unless we can change North Korea's strategic calculus beforehand. That's one most immediate challenge we have, and I think we can will have to find a way out. Another thing is how we work together in dealing with, in seizing the opportunity for unification. I don't think this opportunity will come tomorrow, but I think it's coming. In due time, I think there will be an opportunity for unification. And I think US and ROK should be very well prepared to turn any opportunity that might arise in North Korea into unification. And we need a very strong US determination to eliminate all obstacles that could arise in the process. I think it would be how strongly US stands behind the ROK will be a testing ground for the credibility and value of the alliance when the moment of truth arrives. Another variable is 123 agreement, nuclear cooperation agreement, which is pending. Lately, I became cautiously optimistic about the prospects of agreement. Ironically enough, I see a glimmer of hope from Iran nuclear deal. Many of you may wonder what ROK-US 123 agreement will have to do with the Iran nuclear deal. I think it will be unfair enough for the ROK to be discriminated against by India, with which U.S. has a nuclear agreement, a peaceful nuclear agreement. But India is not a party to the NPT. And if you think about what kind of the scope of peaceful nuclear activities that India is allowed to enjoy under this U.S.-India bilateral nuclear deal, I think that would be enough for Korea. But I think no one, even in Washington, I can imagine, will argue to discriminate the ROK, a staunch ally of the U.S., against Iran. I'm not only talking about this interim agreement with Iran, which allows Iran to keep its enrichment program on condition that it reduces enrichment rate from 20% to 5%. I don't know what the final agreement will look like, but if the final agreement ends up allowing Iran to retain a fraction of its enrichment facilities now at a reduced rate of enrichment. Let's say if it has now 19,000 centrifuges, and if a final deal allows Iran to keep, say, 2,000, 3,000 centrifuges for research and development purposes, I don't know how U.S. will try to discriminate ROK against Iran. So I see a glimmer of hope, and I think if there is no restriction in the scope of peaceful nuclear activities that the ROK will be allowed to do under a new 123 agreement, I think that will be a boost to ROK-US alliance and the general relationship. Well, one last thing, I'm running out of time. One last thing I would like to mention is strategic cooperation in dealing with the challenges coming from the power shift which is occurring in the region, which is driven by the rise of China. We have to deal with, I think the biggest threat to the security of Korea will come from any country, whether it's China or Japan, any country which destroys balance of power in this region. I'm not going to tell you who is destroying or eroding the balance of power in the region. So that's the future challenge to our security, and how we work out closer security cooperation to deal with the common challenges that come from power shift in the region. That will be also an important determinant of our alliance. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Chung. Actually, the last point he made, I think this is my first time to hear anyone who served in the government to say about the China issue openly, very bluntly, about we have to think about how we can deal with China's rise in the coming days and years. And I think this, the points he made, I think those points should be taken by President Obama seriously before he's coming to Seoul. So what would be his position on that? It would be quite interesting to hear that. And but actually, Ambassador Chun, you did not mention about the other important issue that was raised by South Korean side about the wartime operational control transfer, whether that should be go ahead as it is scheduled, whether it's.
Well,
So I will come back to you later. That's a question I'd like to pose at this point in time. Okay. And Sato, you can respond to all the points made by Minister Kim and Ambassador Chun, but also I'd like to hear, especially what's going on in Washington, D.C., because there's some doubts about the U.S. rebalancing strategy. U.S. is rebalancing, because U.S. is hijacked by Crimea incident and Syrian issues, all like that. So I'd like to hear your understanding, the current mood in Washington, D.C., also taking into the points that were also made by this gentleman. Please.
Well, thank you very much again. I just wanted to remind this audience, especially following these terrific speakers and presentations by former ministers, that I'm not a U.S. ROK expert, as I said. That's not my area of research, but I do work broadly on U.S.-Asia. So in preparing this, and I'll certainly come back to your question about one person's view of the mood in Washington on rebalance, but I thought in preparing to come here, it sort of struck me that one could look at the U.S.-ROK relationship in two ways. One framework to look at it is sort of the bilateral, and we could go through the issues. The state of the alliance and all of the elements of the alliance, adjustment of footprint, OPCON transfer, cooperation on capabilities, how our exercises are going, etc. One could look at the 1-2-3 Accord. One could look at progress on chorus, advantages, disadvantages. One could look at broad sets of other issues in the global environment, in the G20, in the UN, in regional organizations. So you could systematically look at this relationship in a bilateral way. And like anything that you look at very closely like that, you begin to see challenges, difficulties, opportunities. Another way I think you can see the U.S.-ROK relationship today in 2014 is in the context of the rebalance and in the context of the changing distribution, if you will, of power in the region, as the minister said. And thirdly, in the context of what I call the balance of relations in the Asia-Pacific. I think there are four sets of relations that are going on in the Asia-Pacific today. I think the first is U.S.-China. It's not a G2. It's nothing as crude or simple as that. But I think it's fair to say that there is a relationship between U.S. and China that hovers over a lot of things. And I have my own assessment about where we are, and I'd be happy to share that assessment. The second relationship in the region is between the U.S. and other Asian countries. India, Japan, Korea, Australia, Philippines, Vietnam, on and on. So that's the second framework of relations. The third is China's relations with Asian countries. There's plenty to talk about there. And the fourth is intra-Asian relations, non-China-based Asia relations. So if one looks at the framework, one framework is bilateral U.S. ROK issues. And I'm not even going to pretend that I know what's going to happen on OPCON or whether the agreement on 1-2-3 that's been extended for some time will come back in 2 years and be successfully negotiated to the satisfaction of both sides. I don't know. I can't say. But here's how I do think about it in this larger context of the rebalance, of the changing distribution, and of the balance of relations of those four sets of relations. And I summarize it this way. First, U.S.-China relations and U.S.-Asia relations are generally better than China-Asia or intra-Asia relations. So the balance of relations for the U.S. is pretty good. Pretty good. Not perfect, never will be perfect, but pretty good with Indonesia, with the Philippines, with other countries in the region. Second, that the U.S.-ROK relationship in this context seems to me particularly to stand out as being good. And let me give you some concrete reasons why. Again, I'm summarizing, I'm generalizing. It's not perfect. But let me tell you why I think it's pretty good if you consider it in this second framework of the balance of relations amongst players in Asia. First, because there is generally a pretty tight view of shared security and shared threat. That's not shared in every relationship in the region. Certainly not between China and most of Asia. Certainly not between Asian countries themselves. And not fully and always between U.S. and Asian friends and partners. Certainly with allies. So I think that's pretty good in the relationship. The second reason is I can't think of a specific sovereignty or territorial issue. And the minister spoke to sovereignty and territory and the compromises that in the global game of international relations we all make. It seems to me, anyways, we don't have a fundamental disconnect between ROK and US. We don't certainly have a territorial dispute between us. We don't have a sovereignty dispute between us. We generally share perceptions on what's going on in the region on those issues. Third, quite right, as the minister, former trade minister said, Mr. Kim, you're quite right. There are debates in Washington about KORUS and its benefits, losses, which sector. Is it corn? Is it tariffs? Is it goods versus services? Is it investment versus... To me, that contrasts very much with the question, will TPP work at all? It contrasts quite distinctly with the progress on global trade negotiations. In other words, quite right that we have some issues and will continue to massage and manage the differences in our KORUS agreement, but we have a KORUS agreement. To me, symbolically, it stands as a remarkable example of what two democratic states, one of which has 50 million people but a $1.2 or $3 trillion economy, have achieved after long, difficult, careful negotiations. Frankly, not to the satisfaction of either party fully. That's what a compromise by definition is. So from my vantage point, if you put that US KORUS agreement compared to the future of TTIP or the future of TPP or future of Doha or future of RCEP or future of other agreements, Japan, ROK, China, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty darn good to me. Fourth, I'm really struck over the last several years about how generally good the leader-to-leader relations between my country, the United States, and Korean leadership has been. Sometimes we have disconnects. Sometimes people look into each other's eyes and they make mistakes. So in the US ROK relationship, under Presidents Lee, President Park, this outsider, this non-Korea specialist, looks at this relationship when I read all the traffic about other relationships, and I think, wow, there's trust, there's confidence, there's very respectful hearing, there is a sharing of views, there is communication, there is regular dialogue. I will tell you, this doesn't occur in every relationship. It's not unique to this relationship, but it's certainly a particularly strong point in this relationship over the last few years, it seems to me. So I'd flag that. The sixth is that all relationships in the 21st century, post-Cold War, post 9/11, it seems to me to be on a different narrative arc. I know I mentioned it in my opening comments about our project to capture the narrative. Maybe I'm such an old academic now that I tend to speak in these terms and it's not really policy relevant. But I think it's really important in democracies to have a narrative arc that publics can buy into. Because if you don't have public buy-in to the narrative of a relationship, you lose that relationship. Not today, not tomorrow, not next week, not over one issue or one dispute, but it erodes trust, it erodes confidence. I was stunned when, I confess, I did not know until we did the research, that Korea has the top number of joint speeches to presidents speaking to the joint sessions of Congress. I did not know that, I admit. So I think the narrative that's being shaped for a new generation of Koreans, a new generation of Americans far younger than me is, wow, my grandfather had this relationship in Korea, or in Korea with the US, and now we're on the cusp of a very different relationship. And I confess I'm influenced by my 10-year-old daughter who is constantly dancing to Gangnam Style, enough to drive one a little bit crazy once in a while. But it just shows you how Korea is refracting across American society in ways that I couldn't have imagined 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 15 years ago. So what are my recommendations or cautions, and I'll end. The one thing is, a good relationship like this needs persistent management and persistent intervention. Not in a dramatic way, not in a fanciful way, and sometimes not even in a way that leads to the resolution of all outstanding issues. Sometimes we have to walk through the 1, 2, 3 and the extensions, I think, to get where we want to go. It'll take time, we'll need buy-in. Situation will have to be socialized in Congress, in the National Assembly, in the bureaucracies, amongst the public. So I think it's important to push issues, but I think it's important not to rush issues. Second, I think it's really important not to let tertiary issues in our relations with others impinge on the core strengths of the bilateral U.S.-Korea relationship. Now, we all have other relationships in the region and beyond. Sometimes they're difficult. Sometimes they're tricky. The U.S.-Korea relationship doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's not isolated. But just because it's not isolated in a vacuum, we ought not to let those other third-party relationships fill the vacuum or take us out of this kind of core strengths of the relationship. And thirdly, that's my pitch in a time when at least this one American, you can talk to others, many interpretations. My own interpretation of my country's direction, in some senses, we're not turning inward. We're not becoming isolationist. But I think there is a burden on our politicians, our elected leaders, our professional diplomats, to show the value of America's engagement in the world in concrete ways for the American people. That's not isolationism. That's perfectly healthy in a democracy. I was very taken by my Secretary of State's, our Secretary of State's comments in defending, in releasing the 2015 budget. How does this affect American lives? And I think that's a great strength as this project that we've done on Korea Matters and America Matters for Korea shows that. And the minister spoke about the economic benefit. They're not going to be perfect in every sector. Some industries and some things, there will be adjustments. But I think the third recommendation I would have is to build on that strength to show why the U.S.-ROK relationship and the continued investment and engagement in that relationship matters to both sides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Satu. Also appreciate your recommendation, but the persistent management, but instead of the management, I think persistent modernization and upgrading the alliance would be preferable from my own perspective. So you mentioned about that there's no territorial dispute, no sovereignty issue between Korea and the U.S., but actually, this, if we come down to the issue on, for example, comfort woman issue and Dokdo issue, so it goes back to San Francisco Treaty again. So who is responsible for that? So what would be the U.S. position on this, whether the Sea of Japan or East Sea can be parallelly used or not? So actually, U.S. is pushed toward that direction. What would be U.S. position on this issue actually matters a lot from the public eye. So we are glad that more the states are supporting the parallel the use of the East Sea and Sea of Japan, and also, but the other issue, like we are focusing on the comfort woman issue, like in, for example, the former Secretary, the Hillary Clinton, used the term enforced sex slavery. But that kinds of issue, the U.S. comes to deal with when he talk about the U.S.-ROK relations and U.S.-Japan relations. So maybe for the President Obama, his trip to Seoul and Tokyo would be quite challenging one, how we can mediate the two countries. So what would be your recommendation? And what would be U.S. position on that? So I think this, like to open the floor for questions from the floor. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself. So I'd like to ask you to be very brief, not comments or lecture, simply question, please. Okay.
Lecture.
If you need more time to think about the question, I'd like to come back to Minister Kim first. There's a question I posed upon you, please.
All right. Okay. Yes. Well, the first question you put on me was what is the difference or the relationship, or what would be the Korea's choice for TPP and RCEP, and what is the progress in those groups? Well, before my answer on that, I think whatever the setting may be, bilateral, trilateral, regional, or multilateral, the final purpose of sitting together, to negotiate the rule, is to, what can I say, to establish a kind of trade by rule. Trade by rule. Well, if you trade at home, domestic, then government sometimes can intervene in the market, and there will be some final touches, what can I say, to narrow the gap between the haves and have-nots, or to exercise a certain social policies to narrow down the what we call bipolarization in terms of income or in terms of whatever. But if you look at world market, we don't have such ruling power. We don't have any government. So any business person should compete, and that competition is more harsh and more, what can I say, naked. And such kind of competition sometimes, really based on contending energy. But once we institutionalize trade by rule, then such contending energy can turn into a kind of cooperating energy under the rule that we have agreed upon. That's the main purpose and the merit of whatever the agreement we conclude, either in bilateral or trilateral or regional or minilateral. So, in my mind, whatever kind of a setting may be, to sit together to find a good common rule is good for commercial relations. Having said that, the difference between the TPP and RCEP is the presence or absence of U.S. and China. In one group, U.S. is there while China is not there, and the other group, the other way around, vice versa. So, well, having said that, this is not really in competitive race, But of course, there's some difference of how speedy they are moving on. In RCEP, as far as I know, maybe my notion is quite outdated because I quit the government, and it's quite difficult for me to gather, the what can I say, the latest follow up there. But as far as I know, in the RCEP group of 16 countries, 10 ASEAN countries try to play kind of a centrality, what they call ASEAN centrality. But if you look at the degree of openness of their market in ASEAN as a whole, or in 10 individual member countries of ASEAN, that degree is not really high enough, to match the degree of openness of, let me say, Korea-US FTA, Korea-US FTA, or Korea-EU FTA, something like that. So, as far as ASEAN centrality is there, the energy is not really strong enough to push it forward, for a real kind of a trade and investment liberalization. While TPP, U.S. is there, and many countries, who think trade is really important, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand is there. I think once they can tide over some, thorny issues, then maybe they can move quite steadily. And of course, as I told you, U.S. is carrying torch, but of course the carrying itself is not really light and speedy as before, because U.S. has their own problem at home. One good indication is U.S. negotiators has not yet given kind of a trade promotion authority, what they call beforehand, faster track authority. So giving TPA to government hands or not was another very sharp and thorny political issues between Republicans and Democrats. So without that, pushing any negotiations to final stage will be very difficult for any American negotiators. So again, I cannot say which one is better, but both are both are good for us. But once again, as Americans are there, U.S. is there, TPP, it has its own merit to push it forward in a more speedy way. And while Korea so far was so occupied with our own bilateral talks with many countries, but now that we have concluded with bilateral free trade agreement with Australia, Canada, except Japan and Mexico, if you look at the existing members of TPP. So I think this is, again, a good time for all of us to think about the real time of Korea to get on board into that group. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ambassador Chun?
So I'm asked to speak about Afghan transfer, which is not my favorite issue. Well, the reason I resisted temptation to touch upon Afghan transfer is because, regardless of how this is resolved, whether Afghan transfer is delayed or it occurs as scheduled, I thought it wouldn't make a lasting impact on our bilateral alliance. But I know this is a hot issue, and I can notice many who feel very strongly about Afghan transfer from the audience. But I have the reason I'm skeptical about wisdom of further delaying Afghan transfer is for practical reasons. I think our military needs a stronger sense of ownership, stronger sense of responsibility for our own national defense. That's a matter of principle. But apart from that, even if we have a wonderful defense policies, if they are not funded properly from our budget, then they go nowhere. They are not really helpful. So if we further delay the Afghan transfer, what I'm concerned about is that this will not give a sense of urgency to our budget authorities, to our National Assemblymen. We have one exception here, but I don't think there'll be a sense of urgency to increase the national defense budget to meet our challenges from North Korea, to build our what is commonly called a skill chain, to destroy all North Korean, not all, but most North Korean missiles that could be tipped with nuclear devices before they can use them. And we should be also equipped to intercept them, intercept those we fail to destroy beforehand. And this requires a lot of money. And as long as U.S. has the Afghan, from my own experience in dealing with the budget authorities, with the National Assembly, I don't see how we can get financial resources to equip ourselves with those military capabilities. So I think just the kicking the can down the road is not the best approach here. If we have to exercise Afghan any time, I think 2-3 years difference, a delay, will not make a world of difference. I think it's better for our military, our generals, to be psychologically prepared to exercise, to be more responsible, to have a more sense of ownership for our own national defense. And I think without that kind of arrangement, I can assure you that it would be more difficult to get the budgets. We will have nice defense policies without budget. That's the problem. That's why I'm not in favor of a further delay in Afghan transfer.
But the problem actually is about how we can secure enough resources, financial resources, to modernize our forces.
Once we take greater responsibility in defending our own country, I think it's far easier to persuade our budget authorities, our National Assembly. We have to be ultimately responsible. Well, of course, this is regardless of who actually has the Afghan. This is always a joint defense. But I think from domestic political standpoint, I think early transfer of Afghan as scheduled will make the job easier to get proper and stable funding from the National Assembly, from the budget.
So that means we should do our own homework, and so we should pursue
I
the
think so.
Koreanization
Yeah.
or Korean defense.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you for
I know
that.
the generals, the retired generals, they are worried about
Except
Afghan transfer.
General Kim Jae-chang, I think.
I hope he agrees with me, but many, I know many, I have seen many retired senior generals who are opposed to early Afghan transfer. They are worried about. They think about one thing, that how this will affect our national security. But I think I have, in my time as National Security Advisor, I have spent a lot of time in devising a new command structure that will not be much different from the current one. So our chairman of the Chief of Staff will be the commander of the combined forces, not the commander, two U.S. ROK troops, but a U.S. commander will become the deputy commander, and they will sit together in the same room, in the same situation room. They will work closely together. And that was the alternative to Afghan, the structure of command that was devised after the Afghan transfer. I thought that will not make a fundamental difference in our capabilities to conduct wartime operations. So I think there's a way. We can find an alternative. But what we suffer is the budget shortage to build up the defense capabilities required to defend ourselves. No, Japan, for example, they built up their, not only the PEC-3 missile defense system, but they have also SM-3 high-altitude interception system. Many years, right after they first saw the North Korean missile launch in '98, they immediately began building their missile defense system. And we are talking about 2020. And we are we are just hundreds of miles, or not even hundreds of miles away from North Korea. And the complacency, the extraordinary complacency about North Korean threats, I think is partly attributable to the feeling that U.S. will be responsible for our own defense, wherever happens. That I think is not very helpful in building up our own capabilities to defend ourselves.
Thank you, Ambassador Chan. Satu?
Yes, thank you very much. On Minister Kim's comment about RCEP versus TPP, I just wanted to point out, available on our website is a study, now a little bit dated because it was the original when the U.S. agreed to join the TPP negotiations, but a comparative. It was a joint study with the Asan Institute for International Economics and the East-West Center on the relative gains using an equilibrium model on TPP versus RCEP. But of course now TPP, since the study was done, has been expanded in terms of the number of membership. So the model obviously changes because of the much bigger share of the world economy that's covered. But I just point that out to you as a resource. And I think the real important thing that Peter Petrie, our colleague at the East-West Center, who's chairman of the economics department at Brandeis, makes this very important point, which I didn't quite realize, that even under the smaller TPP arrangement 2-3 years ago with the fewer countries, over time what's really important is that these two tracks, TPP and RCEP, come together as regional integration proceeds, because the production and supply chains in this larger integrated Asia with the U.S. fully engaged will lead to gains for everyone. Again, not always perfectly and uniformly, but it matters that trade integration and trade liberalization occur. So I wanted to make that point because it allows me to make my advertisement for that study, but also to hopefully to continue to be employed by my bosses at the East-West Center. The second point is the question you raised about sovereignty. Now, I personally, obviously, not an official, so as I understand it, I would just note that we looked into this when we were doing the research on our joint project. We do use EC and
Yes.
\C of Japan in this document. As I understand it, the State Department uses a particular geographical basis for its determination. So, I mean, I don't have anything to add to the official point, but I would still sort of go back and say that these issues exist, but they don't implicate a sovereignty and territorial dispute between the U.S. and Korea.
But you will be forced to be driven into that direction.
That's a perception you have, clearly.
That's the perception I have.
Yeah. So, but I still maintain that, you know, I don't perceive this as a direct issue for us. And you're quite right, there are legislatures in the U.S. who are contemplating, considering, discussing various pieces of legislation at the state level about naming and which geographical names to use on which maps and textbooks. But that's a matter left to the elected representatives of the states rather than sort of, I think, a national policy.
Thank you. We have time for just one question. So, okay, gentlemen in uniform.
Thank you. My name is David Park. I'm a U.S. Marine officer based in Yongsan. I have a question for Ambassador Chun. You stated that regarding North Korea policy from U.S., you said the U.S. can do more. Would you provide me with one example of what that might be?
So,
Please.
well,
That was directed to you.
I think in the case of Iran, for instance, you have a special legislation with a secondary boycott for countries that do business with Iran. So Korean refineries, for instance, which import oil or gas from Iran, they have they have to reduce their dependence, their imports, by stages under Iran Sanctions Act. And U.S. Iran Sanctions Act targets not only Iran's nuclear programs or any entities that are directly related to Iran's nuclear programs. And you know that Iran is not yet developing nuclear weapons. You know, they are just developing capabilities that can be used later in nuclear weapons programs. But, you know, the U.S. legislation is a comprehensive one that targets civil industries like gas, oil, banking, insurance, construction. I think all areas that could bring cash to Iran, even if they don't have anything to do with nuclear program. In the case of North Korea, which has conducted 3 nuclear tests already and proudly claims that it's a nuclear weapon state, look at the level of sanctions that the international community is implementing. You know, it's just targeted at about all those entities under the military or doing the business for the military. You know, primarily arms sales, and they are prohibited. And they represent, I would say, if you capture all of them, they will represent about 10% of North Korean overseas trade. But North Korea will declare missiles as sugar or cement. And how can you capture all of them? Only a small fraction of those proscribed items are actually captured. So the impact on North Korean economy is marginal, is minimal, and North Korea has no problem in retaining. It doesn't really feel the pain, or enough pain to change their mind, to determine that nuclear weapons are not a source of salvation, but this is the slippery road to their own collapse. So the price they are paying for their nuclear armament is nominal, is without teeth. They have no reason to give up nuclear weapons. So Kim Jong-un is proudly pursuing the parallel policy of nuclear armament and economic development. So if we have the right kind of sanctions, comparable to the ones that the international community has on Iran, I wouldn't exclude the possibility that North Korea will change its mind and make a strategic decision. Well, North Korea may choose that collapse with nuclear weapons is better than surviving without nuclear weapons. But I wouldn't exclude the possibility that they could decide otherwise.
Thank you, Ambassador Chun. For your information, if you check our website, you can see some issue briefs which are relevant for your question, and also I urge you to check the Asan Forum. That's our e-journal, so actually we carried his comments on that also. I hope you urge you to look at it. And then with that, let me conclude this session with a warm thanking the applause for these speakers, please.